The Detroit Lions' initial 53-man roster is officially complete. After months of competition, a great preseason, and a ton of camp battles, we officially know the first 53 players to officially be known as Detroit Lions. And today, we're going to take a look at that roster, take a look at the players we knew were going to make the roster, take a look at the depth players, take a look at the surprises that ended up making this roster and talk about why they did. We're going to go through every single player, all 52 of them that are currently on the roster, as well as a couple of predictions of how this roster might change within the next couple of days and potentially some practice squad eligible players as well. So let's start off with the quarterbacks. Now, of course, the quarterback competition, at least in my opinion, was pretty set in stone from the very beginning. Jared Goff is going to be your quarterback one, and Hendon Hooker is going to be your quarterback two. There was no reality in which Hendon Hooker got released by the Detroit Lions, being a former third-round selection, and there was no situation that Nate Sudfeld was going to beat out Hendon Hooker for the quarterback two spot. Now, I do believe that Hendon Hooker did beat out Nate Sudfeld partially due to the youth and, of course, the draft capital used on him. And if Jared Goff does go down for a significant amount of time, there is a chance that they do bring back Nate Sudfeld to play if there is, say, a month or 2 months or a season-ending injury to Jared Goff. I think in a one-game situation, they do trust Nate Sudfeld a little bit more than Hendon Hooker at this point in time, but there was no reality where they were going to carry three quarterbacks, and there's no reality where they were not going to keep they were not going to keep Jared Goff and Hendon Hooker on the roster. I do believe that Nate Sudfeld will return to the practice squad, so I think he will still be a Detroit Lion, but I don't think there was ever a real chance of him making the original 53. Now, running back is a situation that I went back and forth on. I said that a couple of days ago, I thought the Lions were only going to keep three running backs, but I also thought that they were going to keep 4 tight ends and 5 receivers. They only ended up keeping 4 receivers and 3 tight ends. That did open up a spot for Craig Reynolds, who was the last player that I cut for my prediction video. Now, the running back core, I think, is really strong. Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery are a top 2 running back duo in the NFL. Craig Reynolds is a player that the Lions have loved for a very long time, and the odds that he was leaving were a little bit low. I was taking a shot trying to, maybe predict something that was out of the ordinary, but he was going to stay with the roster more often than not. And of course, Sione Vaki, the 4th-round selection, makes the roster as well. I think this is one of the deepest, if not the deepest, running back cores in all of the NFL, and I'm really excited to see how each of them gets carries, see how much work Sione Vaki gets, see how much work Craig Reynolds gets, of course, what the split is between Montgomery and Gibbs, and really see how the Lions are going to utilize their now quartet of really strong Detroit Lions running backs. At wide receiver, they decided to go a little bit thin. Khalif Raymond, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Isaiah Williams, and Jameson Williams are the official players to make the roster. Now, after and almost immediately after the deadline to cut down to 53, the Detroit Lions did sign Tim Patrick, the wide receiver from the Denver Broncos, who some are reporting is starting on the practice squad, and some are reporting that he is just immediately going to be added to the active roster. The Lions do officially have 1 open roster spot as of right now with 52 players, so the spot is available. But as of right now, from what I can tell, he is actually going to start on the practice squad and work his way to the active roster. Now, the 3 of these players on the list that were guarantees were Khalif Raymond, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Jameson Williams. They were players that were guaranteed a roster spot, did not play in the preseason, and were pretty much locks from the very beginning. And I think after the preseason, there was a pretty good shot that Isaiah Williams was going to make this roster as well. Arguably the most impressive offensive player from all of the preseason, super hard worker, exactly what the Detroit Lions want in a football player, exactly what the Detroit Lions want in a person, kind of the primary backup, I would believe, to probably Amon-Ra St. Brown. They play a very similar brand of football, look pretty similar on the field, and I do think Isaiah Williams is a really strong depth option that not only earned a roster spot, but potentially played his way into some reps in the regular season as well. Again, Tim Patrick is joining this roster potentially and likely as the wide receiver 5, but there are some other options out there. Terrence Marshall, Noah Brown, Kadero Hodges are all players the Lions could potentially be looking at, so we will have to keep an eye on that as well. But I would not be surprised if that last and open roster spot does go to a wide receiver the Lions sign from waiver wire or free agency. Moving over to the offensive line and the tight ends. A shocker here. Parker Hesse ends up making the roster over guys like James Mitchell and Shane Zylstra. Now, while I don't really think it's that crazy that he made it over Shane Zylstra, I do think it's pretty wild that James Mitchell got cut. James Mitchell is a player that, despite not being utilized a ton throughout his first 2 seasons, I thought was at least good enough at the tight end 3 position. But I do know that through camp, Parker Hesse was a great player. He was a phenomenal blocker for the Detroit Lions offense and was a good enough receiver. And of course, being behind Sam Laporta and Brock Wright, a great tight end duo for the Detroit Lions, I think it's really interesting to see a guy that a lot of people didn't expect to make the roster to end up making it as, I believe, an undrafted rookie free agent. So they go 3 tight ends there. Despite having a lot of depth at tight end, the Lions tend to go a little bit lighter, but I wouldn't be surprised if Zylstra or Mitchell or even both end up back on the practice squad if they do end up clearing waivers. Now, the Detroit Lions went very, very deep at the offensive line, and they ended up keeping 10 players on the offensive line. Taylor Decker was, of course, an obvious one. He's going to start at left tackle. Dan Skipper was pretty obvious. He is the offensive lineman 6 for the Detroit Lions, comes in on 6 offensive lineman formations as well as tight end at times. Giovanni Manu was always going to make the roster as a 4th-round selection. Graham Glasgow was the starter at left guard. I think Coyote Awaska was a pretty big lock for the Detroit Lions, started in the NFC Championship game last year and was really, really good. Frank Ragnow, of course, was a lock. Mitchell Neese is an interesting one, a player that not everybody thought was going to make the roster, a player that I didn't think was going to make the roster. I thought it was going to be Kingsley Eguakon, but the Lions end up cutting him, keeping Mitchell Neese, and they do feel like he is the right option for the offensive line. And then, of course, you have Kevin Zeitler, Penei Sewell, and Colby Sorsdale, who, again, were players that you were pretty certain were going to make the roster. I would imagine that when healthy, Christian Mahogany will take the position of Mitchell Neese, but he also potentially might move on from, a guy like Coyote Owasika, who is a guy that I think the Lions really like, but obviously you draft Christian Mahogany for a reason. I do think when he is healthy, he will take one of those 2 spots, again, being Coyote Owasika or Mitchell Neese. Moving over to the defensive side of the ball. Once again, the defensive line was pretty deep with Marcus Davenport, Josh Paschal, John Cominsky still being on the roster, which is interesting for the Lions. Aleem McNeil, DJ Reader, Levi Onwuzurike, Mekhi Wingo, Aiden Hutchinson, and James Houston. Not too many surprises here. Marcus Davenport and Josh Paschal were always going to make the roster. John Cominsky, I think, is a player that will not be on the roster for very long. There is a rule in the NFL that you could only put so many people on injured reserve per day or before the actual cut down of the roster. The rules are very confusing. There's a reason that I'm not an NFL general manager, but from what I understand, there is a high likelihood that John Cominsky gets put on IR after today and after the practice squad is kind of complete. That way that they can register him as a player that will be returning at some point this season. They did that with Broderick Martin and Emmanuel Mosley yesterday. I believe after the practice squad is complete, the Lions can then do that with John Cominsky, therefore putting him on the injured reserve, opening up a second roster spot, being down to 51 players. And with that, I would imagine they bring back Kyle Pico, a veteran player who was released, but likely to return after taking first team reps all of camp and not playing a single snap of the preseason. That is just my prediction. I don't know. I don't have any inside sources on that, but that does seem like the likely scenario that by the end of the day, John Cominsky will be on season returning injury reserves, while Kyle Pico returns as another interior defensive lineman. Aleem McNeil was going to make the roster. DJ Reader is going to make the roster, was activated from the PUP list yesterday. Levi Onwuzurike has apparently been one of the most impressive players throughout camp. Mekhi Wingo, I thought, had a really strong preseason. Aiden Hutchinson, the team captain, of course, was going to come back. And James Houston, despite not being the best Sam linebacker that they wanted him to be, I thought was a pretty clear lock for this roster. Arguably the second best pass rusher on the team, elite bend, elite burst, great explosiveness, able to get to the quarterback time and time again. Hopefully the Lions have learned their lesson and they will play James Houston as an edge rusher and a pass rusher as opposed to putting him in coverage 40 yards down the field. At linebacker, the Detroit Lions went 6 linebackers. A player that I did not expect to make the roster was Ben Neiman. He ends up making it as the linebacker 6, but other than that, the rest of the roster is pretty cookie cutter and chalkboardy. Jack Campbell, Alex Anzalone, Malcolm Rodriguez, Derek Barnes, and Jalen Reeves-Maybin. Ben Neiman, the veteran, is going to be the Anthony Pittman replacement, right? Special teams guy, lots of energy, kind of the special teams ace and captain of that group. And I think will be a really good addition to special teams as well. But that, again, was pretty cut and dry. Moving over to the secondary, a couple of surprises here. With Terrion Arnold making the roster, of course, as the first-round selection, Brian Branch making it as a phenomenal slot/safety player from last year. Carlton Davis, the big-time trade from the offseason, was always going to make the roster. Those three played very little or not at all throughout the preseason. Khalil Dorsey made the roster, a prediction that was right from yesterday's video. A special teams ace, a big hitter, a player that has the great mindset that the Detroit Lions love. He returns after a pretty impressive camp, and I think not an awful preseason showing. Brandon Joseph makes the roster. Again, a prediction I got right from yesterday. Brandon Joseph, a player the Lions really wanted to get on the field in 2023, wasn't quite able to do so, but had a forced fumble, had an interception in the preseason. I thought was by far the Lions' best safety throughout the preseason. He ends up making the roster as likely the safety 4. Kirby Joseph was always going to make the roster, did not play in the preseason. Ifeatu Melifonwu, despite battling an injury and not playing much throughout the preseason, will make the roster, as will Ennis Rakestraw and Amik Robertson. Kendall Vilder will return to this roster as the cornerback 5/6 after being the cornerback 2 a season ago. And then I think maybe the biggest surprise of this 52 is Lauren Strickland, a player that we talked about briefly in the middle of July, a player that is a massive hitter, has pretty good instincts, a great special teams contributor, but especially throughout the preseason played really well. Played snaps at the deep safety position, played snaps as the box safety, was a massive hitter, a heat-seeking missile when any player really had the ball. I mean, Lauren Strickland was flying across the field to go make tackles. He was a big hitter. He was a strong tackler. I think he will be a phenomenal special teams ace. And the Lions actually end up sticking with 5 safeties this year, of course, with Brian Branch having the versatility to go back and forth amongst the safety and the cornerback room. Special teams did have a small surprise as Scott Daly was replaced by Hogan Hatton. But Jake Bates, of course, takes the kicker job while Jack Fox takes the punting role. I think Jack Fox will potentially be on kickoff duties from the new kickoff rules. And, of course, Jake Bates having a little bit of a shaky preseason, missed an extra point and a field goal. But overall, I believe went 5 for 6 on field goals and went 3 for 4 on extra points. Overall, it was pretty solid in the preseason. Hit a couple really big kicks. I think is an improvement over what the Detroit Lions had a season ago and what they might find elsewhere throughout free agency in the NFL. So that is the Detroit Lions' original 52. They end up having an open roster spot now and potentially 2 open roster spots by the end of the day. I do think that John Cominsky will be placed on IR as soon as practice squads are finished, as soon as the Lions are allowed to do so. I think they will put him on injured reserve with a designation that he will return late in the NFL season. Now, my predictions for the roster spots that are available. As I mentioned earlier, when John Cominsky goes on injury reserve, I do think Kyle Pico will return. It seems very odd to me that Kyle Pico all offseason and all preseason not only didn't play a snap, but was told consistently by the coaching staff not to worry about it, that he was okay, that he was going to make the roster, taking reps with the first team defense over and over and over again late in the preseason process to then flat out be released. I think that's very, very unlikely and very odd as a scenario. So I do believe that the Lions, in order to have John Cominsky return late in January, if not for February, I think they want to have him on the roster. So they're going to bring him. They're going to take John Cominsky out. They're going to put Kyle Pico back in. He will make the roster. Of course, now not being a veteran cut, he wasn't waived, right? He can't be picked up off of the waiver wire. So the Lions very well could have walked up to Kyle Pico and said, hey, we're going to release you for the day. You're going to potentially technically be a free agent, but we're going to put this guy on injured reserve. We're going to bring you right back to the roster. So just don't sign away with any other team. I think that is the most likely outcome there. And then, of course, with that open roster spot, I think the Lions will address the wide receiver position. They went 4 deep at running back, so they're not going to add there. They went 3 deep at tight end, which I think is more than serviceable. They went deep at the offensive line, deep at the defensive line, deep in the secondary, deep at linebacker. And really the only position as of right now that feels a little bit shallow is the wide receiving room. They have 4 players right now, 3 of which are super proven, 1 of which is an undrafted rookie free agent. So either I think they will bring Tim Patrick up to the active roster pretty early on, or they're still looking for that wide receiver, right? They're still looking at Noah Brown. They're still looking at Terrence Marshall. They're still looking at Kadero Hodges, players that are young, players that are big-bodied, players that can go up and be that X-player after Doris Fountain and Donovan Peoples-Jones failed to make this roster. The only logical step is that the Lions add at wide receiver. I know that last year their wide receiver 5 and 6 only had about 10 and 7 catches respectively, but they do still need a wide receiver 5. The depth is still very, very shallow. And honestly, adding Tim Patrick and Noah Brown together, one on the practice squad and one on the active roster, seems like honestly the Lions wide receiving core would be pretty good, right? Noah Brown put up 500 yards and 2 touchdowns last year as the X in Houston, or one of the X's in Houston. You have Amon-Ra St. Brown, the All-Pro, Jameson Williams, the breakout, Khalif Raymond, the reliable, slot receiver / deep ball threat, Isaiah Williams, the high upside UDFA, with Tim Patrick now being the reliable veteran, kind of the Josh Reynolds replacement. I think all of a sudden this Lions wide receiving core went from being just okay, maybe slightly below average, to okay, they have now 4 positions and 4 reliable guys if they can stay healthy. If they add Noah Brown or another reliable X-type wide receiver from the waiver wire, I think they could be pretty good to go for this season and actually turn out to have one of the better depths in the NFL, in the NFC, if not the NFL. So that is my prediction for the roster. But as of right now, that is how it looks. 52 players are currently on the roster. We will have a practice squad by likely the end of the day. And of course, we will get updates on that as well. But with all of that being said, that is all for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you have yet to subscribe to the channel, please go down below and do so. It helps the channel out a ton. And we are shooting for 4,200 subscribers by the time the Lions kick off on Sunday Night Football. So if you could help us reach that goal, I'd be greatly appreciative. And of course, hit the bell notification so you never miss a video. But with all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.